Some breaking news coming in from the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court has dismissed the Union government's curative petition seeking additional compensation from Union Carbide Corporation by reopening the settlement in the Bhopal Gas Tragedy case, one of the world's worst industrial disasters that took place in Bhopal in 1984, in which hundreds were killed and lakhs were exposed to deadly gas. The Supreme Court said it is the UCC's allegation that the Union and state did not detoxify the environment. So the Union Carbide arguing that the government itself did not do enough. The Supreme Court said the settlement can be set aside only on the ground of fraud, and no ground of fraud has been pleaded by the Union of India. Interestingly, the Supreme Court also said that a sum of 50 crore lying with the RBI shall be utilized by the Union of India to satisfy the pending claims. So this is important that the Supreme Court, however, understanding that many of those affected by the gas tragedy require more funds, that they perhaps were not given enough enough help in terms of medical expenses and the impact that the tragedy had on them. So therefore, 50 crore lying with the RBI shall be utilized by the Union of India to satisfy pending claims. Let's go across to Sunil Prabhu now for more. So Sunil, take us through this development. First up, the Supreme Court dismissing this plea, but also making various other points. Take us through it.
That's right. It's important. It's a five-judge bench. It's a constitution bench of the Supreme Court, led by Justice Krishna Kaul. Basically dismissing the petition on the curative, saying that there has to be a ground for fraud, which has not been the case. They say it's Union Carbide's case that they have not actually detoxified, that the money that is being lying unused, that is 50 crores, should be used now. Really saying that they haven't been able to understand the justification for the government of India bringing this curative petition in 2010 and the reasons thereof. Gargi, for viewers to understand this in perspective, this dates back to 1989. The tragedy, the industrial tragedy that took place in 1984, where lakhs of people were affected and still are affected, that settlement took place in 1989, where the criminal liabilities were taken away. In that ground, that the Supreme Court finally settled the matter and took away the criminal liabilities. And subsequently, there were other judgments in 1991 and thereabouts, but it has never been able to really address the issue. Way back in 2010, because of the huge media outcry at that stage and the fact that many people didn't get sufficient compensation, because the amount of people at that time which was decided in 1989 was far less than the amount that was decided later on in 2010. So it's in that backdrop that the Supreme Court now has dismissed the petition. What it means for people from the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, and in that context, something that really will mean terrible for them, those who have been affected by cancer, renal, many people who have died. They will not get that adequate compensation because it was decided and settled way back in 89. And you can't really revisit and relook at this entire issue at this stage. There was a review petition that also was dismissed. So it's in that backdrop that this entire, it finally brings a culmination of an end to this long and terrible tragedy that took place in Bhopal, where lakhs of people were affected, many thousands died. Yet justice and compensation was given on an agreed sum, not according to international standards. But that debate will continue. But the Supreme Court has finally dismissed that curative petition of the central government, which had been put forward in 2010.
Right. Sunil, also interesting that the Supreme Court saying that a fund of 50 crore lying with the RBI shall be used for the pending claim. So that's an interesting aspect as well. Tell us about that.
Well, you must understand what happened was that Union Carbide, then now of course it's become Dow Chemicals, had given money in dollars to the government of India. That has been lying in her RBI account and has been accruing interest. So what they've actually said, which is amounts to approximately 50 crores, that should now be given to the petitioner. So that's the point that they're making at this stage, because after all, interest has been earned by the government of India, and they had not unused that amount, and that amount was in dollars. So that interest now will be given to those who have been adversely affected in the last few years.
Right. Even if we talk about Union Carbide, Sunil, the company itself does no longer exists, and then there was Dow Chemicals, and even there have been developments. So that too is something that the Supreme Court thought about, and it said that this would open up a Pandora's box if we allow something like this.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why they've put these strong grounds, and that is why they've dismissed it. But as I said, it's finally a full circle. If an incident like this would happen today, Gargi, there would have definitely been far more stringent conditions to ensure that in a developing country, people were adequately compensated. If tomorrow the same thing would have happened in the United States of America, it would have been a different, entire settlement claim. But because we were third world, and we are talking about 1989, nearly 40 years ago, the incident in 1984, the settlement was done, and it was done in the best interest by the Supreme Court at that given juncture. As I said, at that time, the amount of people who were affected were only so much. It has later increased, it has been shown that many people have been affected, and it's in that backdrop that this entire, proceedings have followed. And this will finally bring an end to that entire settlement claim.
Right, a long, pending case, and a long, pending demands by those affected by the Bhopal gas tragedy. And also, Sunil, we must remark on this bench. It was a 5-judge bench that looked into all aspects of this issue and then came to this verdict.
That's right, because it was a 5-judge bench which actually heard it in the first place. So anything that had to be done had to be looked at it in its entirety. It's great, even though this was taken up in 2010. If you remember the media frenzy and the entire claims of how at that time the late Arjun Singh also was asked, P.V. Narasimha Rao was looked into. How did Walter Addison, for example, be allowed to get away from India? Isn't there a criminal liability? All those questions were asked way back in 2010. Which led for a group of ministers to be constituted, which finally then decided to put a curative petition before the Supreme Court. Now, 13 years later, we are getting that judgment on this important matter.
Right. The Supreme Court also saying if it is reopened, that it will only work in favor of UCC, Union Carbide, by opening up Pandora's box, and will be to the detriment of the claimants, is what the court said. If you could just tell us more about that.
So we'll have to wait for those fine prints, because this is a 5-judge bench. It's a long verdict. How it will be to their detriment is something that I'm also waiting to read the fine print. But it is something that needs further study. As I said, Gargi, today, if you look at that point in terms of if this happened in the United States of America or any other developing country, would that standard be followed? In terms of compensation, would that be acceptable? What people who were affected in the Bhopal gas tragedy got?
Right. So just to explain to our viewers, going back on this case right now, it has been dismissed. But one of the arguments that many of the activists and the organizations that have been supporting those affected in the Bhopal gas tragedy had said that, at the time that those affected were forced to take a deal, which was, much below global standards, anything that, as you pointed out, would have been done in the US. And they were just asked to, accept what was offered to them, and this entire matter was closed.
That's right, and that's the reason why this curative petition was put to relook and look at the possibility of how we can, see that people from those who have been affected in the Bhopal gas tragedy, because compensation has to be given. People who have been affected have to be given, a better, for their lifestyle, because they've been affected. There've been cancer-related deaths. There have been cancer cases. There have been renal failures. There have been people who have been affected with a whole host of issues by that fumes that came out from that, carbide factory on that fateful 4th December at night in 1984. And it's in that backdrop that this entire scenario, has played out. And finally, the Supreme Court has decided to, say one way or the other that there is no grounds for relooking at the entire compensation claim, and for Dow Jones now, then Union Carbide, to be given a chance to give extra compensation.
All right, Sunil, thanks so much for joining us with those details. We're also joined by Anurag Dwari from Bhopal. And first up, the breaking news we're tracking. Supreme Court Constitution Bench has dismissed the centre's curative plea, which was seeking an additional 7,800 crore from Union Carbide Corporation successor firms to extend higher compensations to the victims of the 1984 Bhopal Gas Tragedy. Anurag, now this is a case that you have followed very, very closely, and there's been such a fight for justice for the Bhopal Gas Tragedy victims, who were also, in a sense, let down by their own government at the time when they were not given adequate compensation. But now this case has been dismissed by the Supreme Court.
Yes, Gargi, and see the tragedy. The government itself has said that, 5,295 people died in the Bhopal gas tragedy, the central government. The state government has said that 15,342 people died during the Bhopal gas tragedy. And ICMR has said that more than 25,000 people died. So three government agencies are giving contradictory statements about the number of people who have died in the Bhopal gas tragedy. And you go to any of the colonies of the Bhopal gas tragedy survivors, you will find the people are still waiting. We have done so many stories about the victims of Bhopal gas tragedies, especially in the past few years, that how the pension was stopped to the widows of the Bhopal gas tragedy victims. And they were waiting for this, compensation. But now the Supreme Court has dismissed the curative petition. Few days back, they were sitting in, protesting in the Neelam Park area and in different parts of the Bhopal also. So many activists died during the struggle a few years back. Muhammad Jabbar, fondly called as Jabbar Bhai in Bhopal, he died and he fought for almost 3 decades. But now I just spoke to the, survivors and the activists fighting for the gas victims. They all are feeling dejected.
All right. Anurag, thanks so much for joining us with those details. The centre's plea to reopen the settlement for the Bhopal gas affected has been dismissed by the Supreme Court.